effectively you need to create a lot of housing units that are not going to rent for market rents. So some government in some way has to put some money up front or with ongoing operations funding into, or giving people rent supplements. There are different ways of going about it, but basically you need to provide apartments that are going to be cheaper than the market will provide for people.
So we're going to go first to Cherise. Welcome.
So the question I was asked, I think the name of this panel is, are we building a city for everybody? So this morning I got up and I had a coffee and I took some notes and just kind of freestyled around this idea because I sometimes don't know where to start there. So I just kind of like blue streaked it and then it was hard to stop. So I'll try and be quick. So my first thoughts were, of course, we're building a city. So my big answer to that is no, but we could get better. We're building a city where the wealthiest can afford to buy a home, unless you won the housing lottery or the real estate lottery and bought your home 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and even where most people can't even afford to rent in the more preferred locations that are close to their jobs. We've built a city where the highest percentage of service workers, sales workers, trades, transport, manufacturing workers, lower income people have to live the furthest away from the best jobs in the city. And they have to suffer the longest commutes, but they are not driving there because most of these people don't have cars. For example, in Northeast Scarborough, 80% of the trips downtown are by transit, and from North Etobicoke, 83% are by transit, and these are not subways, these are buses with long commutes, poor connections. So lowest income, furthest from the jobs that pay well, and these areas are the least served by transit than anywhere else in the city. And this is because a lot of our transit investments decisions are made for political reasons, not for where we actually need to build our infrastructure. We've heard a lot of discussion over the last decade, I think it is it a decade already, about the Scarborough Subway, and how the last two mayors have prioritized a one-stop subway that will suck up $3.5 billion, where we're not building rapid transit, takes money away, takes budget, takes oxygen away from building it where we need it. And yet, we are still stunningly building a city for cars. Our population is on track to double in downtown over the next couple decades, and we can't afford to put twice the number of cars on the roads. But we're not making the right investments into safe cycling infrastructure or walking infrastructure that can save people's lives. We are investing $1.4 billion to rebuild the eastern stretch of the Gardiner East Expressway. So $1 billion for 1.7 kilometers of elevated highway that will serve only 3% of our peak commuters. 5,300 people. Someone out there is doing the math, let us know. And you compare that to cycling, which is also 3% of our commuters. And people are dying on our streets because we refuse to prioritize investment there. It's like there's a double standard. Instead, cycling lanes are being built piecemeal. We get little bits here and there because of communities that have the most resources or capacity to fight for one or to battle for one. So that's safety and public health is not equitable in our city. And 80% of our vulnerable road users, these fatalities are pedestrian, not cyclists. And 88% of them are occurring in the suburbs, where the road infrastructure is the most hostile to people. Yet, we can build a safe grid, a 525-kilometer safe grid of protected bike lanes crisscrossing the city is only 115 million. That's a bargain. And we know if they build it, they will come. If we build it, they will come. The Bloor bike lane, which was 2.6 kilometers, a pilot, the cycling along that lane doubled in that year that it was introduced. Harbord Street, 40% of traffic are cyclists. It's the longest contiguous bike lane in the city. And yet, we still won't invest in that infrastructure. I'll give you one more stat and then I'll close up. 4%, so we had 3%, 4% of commuters ride the GO train. Yet we don't have to debate, justify, or run a pilot for every dollar that's invested in GO infrastructure and upgrades. Not that we shouldn't, we should build that. $16 billion the Ontario government is investing in upgrades. John Tory's Smart Track, $2.7 to $3 billion to upgrade part of the GO system that enters the city of Toronto. The King Pilot project only cost $1.5 million, and it moves 80,000 people per day. Ridership has gone up, reliability has gone up, and the King Pilot has saved downtown commuters approximately $11.5 million per year in saved time. Yet again, we have to fight and pilot those solutions. One last anecdote, Councillor Mike Layton was on a panel that we hosted a couple of weeks ago, and he was describing the long process of getting a pilot for the Bloor bike lane. He said the amount of time, energy, paperwork that it took, if we want to build our grid of 525 kilometers of bike lanes, that would take 200 years.
Wow.
But I'm going to stop on a high note and say that the public library system is one of the most equitable things we have in Toronto. Every neighborhood, every demographic, every income has access to knowledge and community activities and community supports. So thank you.
That's great.
All right.
And before I pass it off to Alex, I just think you bring up a really interesting point, something I've been really struck by watching this provincial government, get into office and take their space and express their vision for our province, has been their inclination to just start doing versus piloting. It's just, and I think as a citizen, I'm like, government's allowed to do that? They're just allowed to do stuff like that? Yeah. And so it does make me think, like, we can elect people, all sorts of people, who will just start doing. And so it just, it's been a surprise to me, and I think so many of us, that power does exist to move beyond pilots. So for better or for worse. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I'll take us in a slightly different direction, although I would endorse pretty much everything that Cherise just said, maybe in slightly angrier tones than Cherise used. But I want to talk about building, and I want to talk most of all about housing. So to your point, Zahra, Toronto Community Housing has 58,000 units right now, and the vast majority of those were built within a 10-year period at a time beginning about 50 years ago when the old city of Toronto was much smaller and much less wealthy than our current city is today. So when it comes to the housing question, and one of the two basic challenges that faces us right now, which is genuinely affordable housing, we have the capacity to solve that problem if we want to. Unfortunately, right now we don't. But we simply don't put either the money or the political capital into solving that problem. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind during this election campaign while we talk about that issue. But if there are two basic problems sort of facing us in the housing market right now, and the one is what you could call genuinely affordable housing, the other is what you could call middle class affordable housing or attainable housing. So on that score, I want to ask people a question. Two questions. Let's talk about condos. So raise your hand if you agree with the following. Condos are for rich people. Good number of hands. Condos are springing up everywhere across the city. I am here to tell you that you are wrong. I was going to bring some maps with me today, which would have helped to illustrate this point, but I have been making this argument to a lot of people over the last year or two, and everyone, architects, planners, urbanists, people who know this stuff, who know this field, are shocked by these numbers. But the fact is that most of Toronto is not growing. If you look back at the census over the last 15 years and you break Toronto down into separate census districts, something like 2/3 of them have either lost people or have basically gained no population at all. So during this last 20 years of what feels like this out-of-control development boom, the fact is that most of Toronto is stagnant. And this is surprising to me, it's surprising to everybody. The counterpoint to that is that in a few places, such as where we are on the western half of downtown, and in a few very specific pockets across this very large city, you have what feels like development getting out of control. And I don't think that many of us understand why that is the case, but it is, more than anything else, that is a policy decision. A lot of the new housing that the city needs, and the city does need a lot of new housing, is being crammed into very few places, particularly because those places didn't have any neighbors to complain about the new buildings going in. That's it. I mean, that was, quite literally the political trade-off that the old city of Toronto made, prior to amalgamation, in figuring out how to intensify the city while keeping the neighborhoods, which are the most sacrosanct thing in Toronto planning as well as Toronto politics, from being touched in any meaningful way. And I think we really need to re-examine that bargain. Because as much as those of us who live in houses in the neighborhoods, and I am lucky to count myself in that group, are benefiting from a wonderful quality of life, the fact is that, again, many of our neighborhoods are not growing. They are actually have excess capacity in a lot of ways for more people, and we are not allowing those neighborhoods to redevelop into the forms they need to take to accommodate our population as it is today. This is why, more than anything else, why housing is so expensive. We have more people in smaller households, and we have not the right set of houses and housing units to put all of us, and if you already own a house, it may be hard to get your head around this, but I think fundamentally, even middle class and upper middle class people in the city are not going to be able to live in houses anymore. My generation may be the last middle class generation that can realistically expect to do that. And what does that mean? I mean, it means we need to make some kind of radical change. Yeah. And that's going to mean stuff getting built and stuff getting torn down. And that, I think, more than anything else, is the conversation that we need to have when we start talking about housing and about affordability, is where it's going to go, what it's going to look like, and what we need to pull down to make room for it.
So you touch on such a good point, and I think you use the right word, which is radical. But maybe we'll jump off from there. Something I've heard a lot lately was, I'm a cyclist and I'm a driver. I don't live in social housing, but I can't afford rent. Yeah. And there is something radical about not knowing where to be on the political spectrum, because you're like, I'm trapped, but I'm not super marginalized, and so to me, that evokes, that to me feels radical. When you hear about people with six-figure incomes not being able to buy a house, that is radical. And so maybe to kick us off, so where have you seen forms of radical change? Could you sort of illuminate your opinion on what radical could look like, or where it's happened effectively in other places, or maybe even in parts of the city?
Me first?
Anyone, actually, but either of you.
Well, Cherise has some feelings on this issue too, I know. But yeah, I think, it's important to, I think the real solution is, a proposal that we've heard in this campaign for mayor at this point from Jennifer Keesmaat, which is a large-scale program of middle-income subsidized housing. This needs to happen. And this is not a unique need in Toronto.
Wait, can you explain subsidized housing for those in the crowd who don't know?
Sure, yeah,
what
I'm
that
trying to
looks like?
just use the least technical term possible. But I mean, in some way, effectively, you need to create a lot of housing units that are not going to rent for market rents. So some government in some way has to put some money up front or with ongoing operations funding into, or giving people rent supplements. There are different ways of going about it. But basically, you need to provide apartments that are going to be cheaper than the market will provide for people. And you need to provide a lot of them for people who are in genuine need. I mean, I think the waiting list for TCH right now is at 140,000 people. Does that sound correct? Or 150? Yeah. So, I mean, that's what? 7 or 8% of people in Toronto are now on the waiting list for social housing. I mean, that's a big number. And I don't see that number going down. So on the one hand, we need to build through some sort of partnership, and there are various models between government and business. We need to build a lot of middle-income housing that is going to be affordable for middle-income people, and we need to build a lot of housing for people who are just not going to be served by the market. That's going to take money, real money, and I think that the political will for that is going to build. But I also think an important piece of it is allowing the market to do as much as the market can. Because as I was saying, I don't think many people understand that housing is incredibly constrained. It feels like developers can do whatever they want, but the fact is that if you want to build an apartment building in Toronto, even a mid-sized one, there's something like 7% or 8% of the entire land area of the city where you might be allowed to do that. It's completely impossible in planning terms, 92% of Toronto's land to build an apartment building. And that's crazy. And the biggest reason for that, not the only one, but the biggest one, is this planning idea and this political preference for protecting the physical form of house neighborhoods. Because people in houses don't want to have anything bigger than a house built anywhere near them. And that is crazy. I mean, that is, if you want to talk about inequitable, and if you want to talk about unjust, that is unjust and that is inequitable, and it's sooner or later it's going to have to change.
Yeah, I'll just I'll add to that. That's a great summary. I'll throw out a couple numbers and then try and get into some solutions as well. Here's a couple numbers that are pretty staggering. In the past 10 years, Toronto rental market has grown only by 2,400 purpose-built rentals. That means buildings that are built specifically for rental, and that 76,000 of our rental units have been added by secondary, like condos. So condos that have been built that people are renting out, which means that a lot of what's being built, mostly in these towers, are condos for investors. Last year, my organization analyzed not the condos that we see today around us, but what's coming down the pipeline. We looked at every single condo unit that's going to be online over the next 5 years. There are over 100,000 condo units in the pipeline in the region, in the GTA, and 60% of those are one bedrooms. Over 90% are in buildings that are 12 stories and over, or over 12 stories. And in the central city, 80% are in buildings that are 20 stories and over half are in 36 stories and over. So we're building small one-bedrooms in large-scale buildings that are not family-friendly, and this is mostly what is being built. So to your point, we're building tall and we're building sprawl. We are still building single-tract housing on our periphery, where it's getting further and further for people to drive to access that type of a house. So people have a choice. You squeeze into a one-bedroom condo, or you drive 2 hours to a house, because we're not building this medium density housing that we need to house people. And another point about the tall condos that we are building, that 95% of them are sold before the shovel even hits the ground. People don't have a fighting chance to even buy them, and most of those are going to investors.
I guess the counterpoint to that, though, is that those units being held by investors are almost overwhelmingly being rented out.
Yep.
I mean, they are rental units. They're just rentals being, rented in a way that is not particularly efficient and is not ideal. But the underlying demand is for housing from people who live here, right?
Yeah. And I think that what's interesting is that I feel like there's this sense, and this is your point about hanging on to the precious yellow belt, where there's so much
Got to stop you there. Do you want to explain the
sorry,
yellow
I'm
belt?
doing one of those ding, 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 blow the horn. These sort of established neighborhoods that are predominantly single-family homes, which is what, 80% of our land base in terms of residential.
Yes.
About that? Yeah. Okay.
Someone said 2/3. Yeah.
So quite a bit. We just finished a study that we haven't published yet, which looks at the whole land base of Mississauga. So a city that was like the queen of sprawl, that city. It was like, if anybody could do sprawl well, it was Mississauga. It's mostly single-family housing. We looked at the whole land base of the city because, not surprisingly, they've run out of greenfield to sprawl. They've run out of area to sprawl. And so we looked at their land base and we said, how do you build for the population up to 2041 without building tall or without building sprawl? And we found that Mississauga can accommodate all of its population growth in medium density housing, and that would be everything from mid-rise and under.
So buildings of what, 8 stories or shorter down to townhouses?
Yeah, mid-rise is generally up to 11 stories. Near GO stations, places like that, you could get a little bit taller because you want to have more density near transit, so you have more people taking transit. But as you move out radially, your density is going to go down. But this is all multi-unit housing. We're not building more houses. There's nowhere to say build a house and a yard. It's just not possible. But the other thing that was stunning about the study is we found that we could accommodate 80% of all of Peel Region's population growth in the footprint of Mississauga in medium density housing. So it is doable, but the challenges are community opposition, as you point out, zoning, and a lot of the problems with the approvals process.
So I would just, there's something I want to flag, which seems to come up a lot, which is when I hear both of you speak, as someone who identifies as progressive, I'm like, God, this is so obvious. Like, we have the data, we have the research, why aren't we doing it? And it makes me think of a study we did a few years ago, which will not be a surprise to many people, but it was with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change when it was still called that. And it was a study of low-income households and their consumption patterns. And you know, we saw this in the United States in the early 2000s, but essentially what it was low-income households, their consumption goes up as their income goes up. So the second I make money, I'm getting off the bus. The second I'm getting into a car by myself, because that is a sign of success and status. Similarly with housing, similarly with all sorts of things. And so even consumption, right? Like environmental impact, which is what we were studying. And so I would love to talk a little bit about how we start to shift people's mental models of success, because part of the reason that we get so angry at suburbanites is because they just want a yard, they want a house. Like, they're not horrible people. I've met lots of them. They're often really wonderful people who are trying to do right by
I'm
their
related to
families.
some of them.
Yes, some of us are related to some of them.
I grew up there.
Some of us grew up there. See, they're amongst us. We're good people. But I think it's because of the mental model of, like, my kids will be safe. It'll be quieter. So until those mental models change, we can yell about the data till we're blue in the face, but people need to know that you can still feel and look successful if you ride the bus to work, if you live in a co-housing situation. So, like, how do we do that? Like, how do we start to shift the mental models so that people want these things? Because I think that's more people want these things, is my question to you.
Okay, just flying here.
We can just get angry out loud. We don't even have to answer it.
I think it really it comes down to having, like, the ambassador developments that really help to showcase that you can be a family and live in a condo, and there's no longer a stigma attached to, I remember growing up, like, it was the families that lived in apartment buildings were always seen as, poorer than everybody who lived in a house. But, now I think that it's possible for families to live in condos and have everything that they need. But it's a matter of building that typology. It's a matter of building the family-friendly amenities within that typology. I mean, we have to wrap our heads around what living is. I grew up where it was, we had a house, we had a yard, we lived in our backyard, we barbecued, we hung out there all the time. We didn't go to the library, right? Here people go to the library, they go to events. And I think that there's these changes that need to be made within the architecture and the public realm of our buildings. And I think that a lot of the problem is that we build these tall condos which aren't that friendly looking. At the ground level, we're not thinking about people who are walking and what type of retail we want and what type of boutiques and shops and restaurants and grocery stores and things like that. But we can wrap our heads around what is our living room. And our living room is beyond our actual physical space. It's out there in the world. And there's this whole growing idea about, you mentioned co-living, where if you actually sort of outsource some of your amenities that not everybody needs in their small unit. Like you don't need a playroom. You don't need a giant kitchen where you're cooking a turkey. Like a lot of these places. Exactly. A lot of these things can be part of the building and shared. Why does everybody I think about I live in a condo. I've got like carpeting just on my 2 little sets of stairs. And it's like, why do I have to have a vacuum? Why can't we share a vacuum? These types of like co-living where you're actually sharing stuff, that can bring your rental price down if we're talking about rental, or unbundling these types of things for, I've gone totally off topic, right?
No, you're leading us into another great topic.
Okay, I'll stop.
So how do you? Well, you made an interesting point, Cherise. And I want to talk about apartments for a minute. All right, I'll be annoying and ask another question to the room. What percentage of people in the city of Toronto live in apartment buildings, defined as 8 stories or taller? If you think the number is 20% or lower, raise your hand. Okay, a couple of hands. Good number. 30% of people in apartments? 40? Yeah, the number's about 45, 47%. So half of the city of Toronto today lives in apartments. And that's been the case for a long time. I mean, I grew up here in this region and, I had a lot of friends and family who lived in high-rises. I mean, my 2 sets of grandparents, one of whom were, immigrants and, wound up working class, lived in a very comfortable condo in Etobicoke. And my, Canadian old stock grandparents who were middle class retired to an adult-only condo in Scarborough. And this is, starting in 1980. I mean, and there were a lot of buildings, starting from about 1955, 57, you saw the rise across Metro, as Metro grew, of clusters of dense apartment towers. That's been there. I mean, as longer than any of us have been alive, this has been part of the fabric of the city. So, I mean, more than anything else, this whole condo boom has been about people with means acknowledging that might be okay. Right? And then also in choosing to live downtown as opposed to elsewhere. So, partly this is just a matter of us looking around and seeing, the city that we already have. And it really would take, political leaders who would be willing to push us along in that direction, I think would be really helpful. Who we do not have at the moment, for the most part.
Just count to 3. Just take a deep breath and count to 3.
And the other thing is that, I think we need carrots. It needs to be more attractive to live in multi-unit buildings because, number one, it's got to be cheaper. And number two, those buildings have to be located in places where people want to live. And that means a new approach to where and how the city grows. It means transit planning that produces more rapid transit in more places, not a subway that goes to a parking lot and is going to cost $4 billion plus to serve a neighborhood that then needs to be created from scratch, which is what the Scarborough Subway is, by the way. All of the most optimistic projections about the Scarborough Subway involve a neighborhood of high-rise condos which presently do not exist because there is basically nothing within walking distance of that subway station other than the mall. So, we're talking about very expensive, elaborate social engineering in that case. at great cost. When the better option, was debated 10 years ago and was policy 10 years ago. LRTs, which are consistent, light rail, essentially similar to streetcars, but in their own tracks. This is how cities across the world build in low-density neighborhoods, and this is what we need to do. We need to put reliable transit to more places, and we need to allow for smaller scale development, as Cherise was saying, around those places. So more people are able to get around the city and to live in different places in the city comfortably and affordably. It's not rocket science. It's purely a political question that stops us from moving in that direction.
Can I do a hot pursuit on that?
You can do a hot pursuit, and then we have a question right in the
questions
front row.
already. Okay, I'll do a quick hot pursuit. I just wanted to riff on the Scarborough Subway and how you think about that investment that's not even the neighborhoods that I described earlier in terms of the Northeast Scarborough. That's not even close. That's nowhere near it. But yet we could, for the same money or less money, a lot less, build a 24-stop LRT loop that serves that whole city. The other thing that's really great about LRTs, and people don't think about this, is it actually helps to encourage the type of development that we're talking about. That when you build an LRT, it really helps the light rail transit.
Thank you. Which includes things like
the transit itself, or the things that are building?
The transit itself.
Okay.
Yeah,
what does it look like? I thought you just described it. Okay, well, it's not underground. It's above ground. It's not a streetcar, but it actually, the things like the stops are further apart. It moves more quickly, but it is above grade. It's usually in the middle of the street, and it allows for the redesign of the street to revitalize the neighborhood. So you can end up with what's happening in along the Eglinton crosstown, is that you can pre-zone, you can as of right those corridors to build sort of middle income rental and market housing that's more affordable, and it will help to revitalize a neighborhood because developers will go there. Developers will go where that's type of rapid transit
because
and build
people
the
want to
housing.
live near transit stops,
Exactly.
right? Close, not. What's the ratio? It's basically 400 meters is considered walkable, right? For a transit stop?
No, actually 500, I think.
500,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So, a 5 to 7 minute walk, basically. So, yeah, which if you imagine 24 circles this big, a kilometer wide scattered across the city, then all of a sudden
You're covering a lot of ground. Yeah.
And the problem with, even though we love subways, if you look at sort of the history of some of our, like the Yonge Subway, downtown Yonge Street, in some ways has survived the subway going underground. There's still lots of activity above ground. But if you look at stretches of the Bloor and Danforth subway, I used to live on the Danforth, and I didn't live on the Danforth before the subway went in, but I've seen photos of that part of the city, which was really vibrant. There were big, wide sidewalks. There was a streetcar. There were markets and cafes. It was the place to be. The subway came in, and everybody went underground, and that neighborhood still is trying to recover.
Yeah. Now, I want to go to this burning question in the audience. We have one back there.
I don't think it's on.
I'm wondering why is it that Montreal is so much more advanced than Toronto? I mean, it goes to Laval. The subway goes to Laval. Laval is a long way from Montreal downtown. And it's so easy to travel in Montreal. It's a pleasure to go from one subway stop to another subway stop. So what's the problem with Toronto? We are richer, supposedly.
Yeah.
Okay, we like to pride ourselves how great we are, and we are so backwards when it comes to transportation. I live in Scarborough. And
How'd you get here today?
I drove.
You drove today.
But because it takes me half an hour to get here by car, and an hour and a half to 2 hours to get here. So that's the reason. It's not because, I love to take my car. My car is a big expense for me. But I have a choice of half an hour versus 2 hours. That's the difference.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
And also, it's not the poor people who take the subway. My roommate is a 6-figure income, and she leaves at 4 o'clock the office at College Park, and she arrives home at 6 o'clock, Scarborough. Okay, and we are on Birchmount and Huntingwood, okay, which is between Warden and Kennedy and between Finch and Shepherd. I mean, 2-hour commute.
Yeah, it's tough. So the question was why
doesn't Toronto have more subways?
Yeah,
why do we not have better transit?
Yeah, why aren't we going as if the premise is that we are a wealthier city, we're a bigger city. Why are cities like Montreal getting ahead of us in building a subway system at the very least,
Well,
let
they
alone
already-
other types of transit?
They already have it, right?
Yeah, it's true. It was a lot of it.
They do
But
keep
you
on
are
building
right.
it.
You're absolutely right. They invest in building a lot of Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, Ottawa have all invested more in the last 20 years. Vancouver has built 3 times the amount of rapid transit that we have, and the investment, because they raise revenue, they invest, and they make evidence-based decisions. They're not making decisions based on sort of political objectives, like I need to win in an election by saying subways for Scarborough. They're building, and in Vancouver, they have a council that's at large. They don't represent wards. So they're thinking about how do we invest across the city in the best way to serve everyone. It really comes down to politics. I'm not an expert on politics, but I can say that politics has certainly gotten in the way of building transit infrastructure in the city.
We were just talking outside before we came in, or on the other side of that wall, about an amazing transit advocate and blogger, Steve Monroe, who we all adore. And one of my favorite things that Steve talks about is, when you look across the city, there's a graveyard of transit decisions and indecisions that are directly related to the politics of our province. So he recently talked about, if you go to the Kipling station on the south side of the tracks, there's a platform that was supposed to be the streetcar to the airport in the 60s, 70s. I'm looking at you, Alex. You're supposed
He
to have
told
the
me
date.
about that one too. Yeah.
There's a ghost platform, and he gave this talk the other day where he sort of identified very precisely the graveyard of transit investments, or would-be transit investments, that I just think it's embarrassing for us as a city. I want to pause for a second. I'm aware of our time. I'm also aware that the audience is getting really eager. So we're going to open it up formally to Q&A. There was one who's been waving in the back for a little while, and then we're going to come up to the front here. We have a mic coming your way. Okay, so 1,
Hi,
2, 3,
I've been
4,
waiting
5.
because all through the discussion I wanted to address a number of things that you've said, and mainly it has to do with why Toronto has Copenhagen envy.
Yeah.
And so I just went to see the new development on King Street by Bjorky Engels, which is only 19, it's called Serpentine Towers. And it is the most amazing thing that I've seen in Toronto in terms of a building development in a very, very long time. And the thing is, it's only 19 stories high, as opposed to Yonge and Gerrard, for example, that is going to be 80 stories high, something like that. Amazing. But in any case, this is relatively low, and density-wise, it's 500 units. And it looks a bit like Habitat. Well, why couldn't we, and the design of it stems from an art gallery aesthetic. Why can't we have more of that?
Why can't we have
don't.
that? Well, I wrote a very enthusiastic piece about that building, which I think will be very interesting in the way that it connects private housing with the public realm. But it will also be very expensive. It's not going to be cheap to live there. There is Copenhagen envy, though. I like that phrase, because there are a lot of, in the architecture and planning world, there is this idea that tied to what Cherise and I have been talking about with the missing middle, that rebuilding Toronto with mid-rise buildings would be a good idea. And a lot of the city of Copenhagen, as with a number of other Western European cities, has density, has a lot of people in buildings that are not tall. But how they've done that is that, the bulk of Copenhagen is a compact city that was built by 1900 when people were still walking to work. And they're those buildings, which are 5, 6, 8 stories tall, cover the entire city. They don't have in the central city neighborhoods of single-family houses as we do. So, if Toronto was to turn into Copenhagen, I'd be basically all for that, but it would involve rebuilding everything. And, and we're not.
Talk about radical. I think we have one in our audience.
So, but practically, how are we going to get closer to that? In fact, what we do have is just these few small pockets of the city or corridors along certain major streets where the city is encouraging new development, and the city is saying, such as on Eglinton, we'll do these mid-rise buildings all the way along, and that will it'll bring people. It will create street life. The problem with that is that those buildings in themselves, one building on a block surrounded by houses isn't enough. You need the entire city to reach that kind of density. You can't have, an 8-story building surrounded by neighborhoods of houses and on, single-family houses on 50-foot lots as you do in Scarborough. So, it would be, in my mind, great to look at how we could really bring more housing and more density across a lot of the city. But that's just so difficult right now because nobody wants it. I mean,
and the problem with that as well is when we do build, I live in a mid-rise, which is an 8-story building, which is I believe fits into the character of the neighborhood, and there's lots of family-friendly units. But I think part of the challenge is that when most of the missing middle housing, which is low-scale mid-rise or stacked townhouses, get built in some of our established neighborhoods, they're boutique because they're so rare and we're not building enough of them. They're still $1 million. No one can afford to buy them. So the challenge is we know that it's possible on the ground to build this stuff throughout the city and meet a lot of housing needs. And I think right now it's just cheaper, it's more cost effective to build tall or sprawl. If you look at a builder that is building, has a footprint, a lot of the costs are the same whether they build 7 stories or 37 stories. So they're going to go for 37 and a density bonus. So we need to figure out how do you change the rules to make it more cost effective to build the stuff that we need.
This is such an important point because, almost no new development of any kind in Toronto happens as of right, meaning the zoning, which is the specific regulation of what can happen on a particular site, that zoning basically doesn't apply to anything. Nothing that happens respects the existing zoning. And what the city wants to see, in most cases, doesn't match the existing zoning. In Bloor Street in Yorkville, where, there are, at Bloor and Yonge, where there are, 90-story buildings being approved, the zoning on Bloor Street still allows for basically 5 stories.
Yeah.
It's nonsense because we haven't, since amalgamation, haven't had the political will to do a new zoning bylaw, to review all of these rules and to review the city's official plan. Really, in the last 10 years, it hasn't been reviewed, the plan that says what should go where and what form it should take. We need to have, in order to make things simpler, we need to have a real conversation about what we actually want. And in fact, what we have now is haggling site by site over every single development, so that every single development takes 2 or 3 or 4 years just to get permission to go ahead, which is crazy.
I think that's such an interesting point that we're going to go to the question in the front here, and then we have 3 more questions already lined up, so that might be our cap. We'll see how we're doing for time. But before we take that question, I just want to flag, I think that's such an interesting anecdote because we haven't had the political will to look at the zoning bylaws, but I think it's also because citizens aren't asking for it, because that's not something we talk about as citizens. We're not like, man, I'm really hoping a candidate talks about zoning bylaws this election. Like, that's not what you hear.
But in Vancouver, the municipal election in Vancouver right now is turning on exactly this. They've
And
gotten to that point.
Yeah.
I just think
You're right.
it's almost like a rhetorical question, which is like, God, we need people to talk about that and understand that language as a baseline so that they advocate for it. It sounds boring, but it's so material to your experience on the street, your experience in your home. It's fascinating.